Good evening, one and all. A warm welcome to all of you on behalf of National Gallery of Modern Art Bengaluru, under the Ministry of Culture, Government of India, in collaboration with Somberikatte. We are delighted to have you here for the special panel discussion, Nation, Region, Modernity, the Art of K. Venkatappa. Today, we revisit the life, work, and legacy of K. Venkatappa, a pivotal yet often overlooked figure in the history of early modern Indian art. This conversation brings together distinguished scholars, historians, and editors whose research has shaped a fresh understanding of Venkatappa and the cultural milieu of his time. We are honored to welcome a distinguished group of scholars and thinkers: Janaki Nair, historian; Ashish Rajadhyaksha, art curator and film historian; Sherin B.S, cultural theorist; Deeptha Achar, editor; Pushpamala N, artist. This evening, the discussion will be led by Suresh Jayaram, art historian and educator. Before I welcome, a small introduction. Suresh Jayaram is an artist and art historian. He's founder director of visual art collectives, One Shanti Studio, an international artist residency and alternative art space. His work encompasses art practice, urban mapping, archiving, curation, and art education, all of which are influenced by his interests in environmental and urban issues. Jairam has taught art history and served as dean at Karnataka Chitrakala Parishad's College of Fine Arts. He holds a BFA painting and a MFA in art criticism. He has written and published the book Bangalore's Lalbagh, a chronicle of garden and the city, and is now working on a book at Cubbon Park. May I request Mr. Suresh Jayaram to kindly proceed towards the stage and take over from here. And I request everybody to join me in welcoming Mr. Suresh Jayaram.
Good evening, everybody. It looks like a reunion of old friends because most of us met here when the international seminar on Venkatappa took place. And we're meeting again with the book. And also, I think Venkatappa, if he was alive, would be very happy or totally very grudgy about what we're doing with his name. For many of us, Venkatappa is just not an artist, but also an address. Because of the Venkatappa Art Gallery, most of us who are here have just come from inauguration of the Venkatappa Art Gallery by the WAG Forum, which is also very instrumental in reviving his name and the space. But more so, when we listen to all our distinguished speakers who are here, I request all the speakers to come on stage. A word about how Venkatappa is constantly resurrected by many of us. His not only through his memory and his works, but also through the multiple ways in which artists have been looking at him through this seminar which Pushpamala had organized. So, speakers, please come to the stage. I just want to introduce Pushpamala, who is an internationally known independent artist, writer, and curator. She is known for a strong feminist work informed by cultural studies, feminist theory, and history. In 1996, she created a fictional institution called Somberikatte Idler's Platform as a space for intellectual discourse. Between 1997 and 1998, she held a series of seminars on the idea of the folk in her studio. Okay. She curated an exhibition of large public installations in Bangalore city called Starapurana Gadu in 1999, in which many of my students and friends participated. Since 2010, she has programmed Relook, a series of lectures on Indian art history. In 2016, she organized the International Conference on K. Venkatappa, Mysore Modern Artistic Nationalism and the Art of K. Venkatappa at Bangalore to celebrate 20 years of Somberikatte. She was the artistic director of the 2019 Chennai Photo Biennale, Fauna of Mirrors, of which she also organized an international conference on photography, light writing. Most recently, she has curated Handprints, Mind Prints, a traveling retrospective exhibition of Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh's prints. I request Pushpamala to say, talk about her
Thank you,
project.
Suresh. Yeah.
You might have to use the mic.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a background of the book. Basically, we're here to, in a way, launch the book that Deeptha Achar and I have edited of the papers presented at the international seminar that I had organized in 2016. The papers are based on that, of course, reworked, but it's almost like the 10th anniversary of that. So apparently, this is the 50th anniversary of Venkatappa. So all this activity seems very apt. So what I'm going to do is present a sort of background to the book itself, what led to the book, and then later, after me, Deeptha will talk about the book itself and what the book is trying to do and say. Um, so the idea to hold a major conference on K. Venkatappa was born in the late 1990s, soon after I moved to Bangalore and created a fictional institution called Somberikatte or Idler's Platform. Somberikatte, a name suggested by theatre director Prasanna for my newly built studio, because artists are so lazy, was humorously conceived as a notional adda for intellectual debate outside the institutional framework. So actually, I was also thinking about Bertrand Russell's famous essay in praise of idleness, where he looked at idleness as a kind of space for creative sort of energy and creative spark. So the first series, I held a series of 6 seminars. It was on Sunday afternoons at 2 o'clock, and actually there's be a good crowd of 35 to 50 people over there during 1998 to 1999, and it was on the idea. It was on the idea of the folk, scrutinizing the idea of the people or the nation through various disciplines. There were 6 different sessions: film and the folk, environment and the folk, architecture and the folk, art and the folk, technology and the folk, the law and the folk. Actually, I wanted to have 10, but somehow it got derailed. It was a lot of work also. The speakers were Madhav Prasad, S.V. Srinivas, Ashish Rajadhyaksha, Madhav Gadgil, Ramchandra Guha, Nagesh Hegde, Edgar Di Mello, Raj Shetty, Prem Chandavarkar, Janaki Nair, Hans Matthews, Pushpamala, S. Rajagopalan, Nandan Nilekani, Esha Shah, Sita Ramam Kakarala, Babu Matthew, Nandana Reddy, each presenting new papers. The idea was to bring thinkers from different fields together to debate on the notion of the people, the nation, and the marginalized in each discipline. It is obvious from the list above that Bangalore was still a small town where speakers and audience would travel through non existent roads to gather in a distant new suburb to discuss important things. I just built this studio in Rajarajeshwari Nagar, which was absolutely empty. There's hardly anything there. The roads were dug up for the new flyover, so it's very difficult even to get there. So, as these lively seminars were being held, people asked why a larger scale event could not be held. At around this time in 1998, Janaki Nair had written her seminal piece on K. Venkatappa, drawing a line, K. Venkatappa and his publics, which raised new academic interest in the artist and made him contemporary because he was being looked at in a completely different way. I began then thinking of having a national level seminar around his figure. I was not ready yet to organize such an event. Perhaps one saw Venkatappa as a lost ancestor, an important but missing character in the national art history that we studied. The art history we studied was invariably about North India, whether historical or modern. Though Venkatappa was an important member of the Bengal school, his work had been neglected. After his return to Karnataka, his stature and canvas shrank. His national status was forgotten, and Karnataka art was also doomed to be provincial. Later in 1999, I curated an exhibition of large public installations in Bangalore, Sthala Puranagalu or Place Legends. I'm telling you this bit of history because actually the seminar celebrated 20 years of Somberikatte as a kind of non-institutional space. And in fact, it led up to all these various activities. I asked three young artists to create installations around three historic sites which mark different histories of the city. The Samudaya office in Baswantgudi in South Bangalore, the headquarters of a left theatre movement, the Victoria statue on Mahatma Gandhi Road in the centre, the still existing symbol of colonialism, and the Ulster Lake in East Bangalore built by the city's founder Kempe Gowda, first in the city of lakes. We worked for 6 months to research and develop the works. This exhibition was a pioneering attempt at large-scale site-specific installations in an Indian city. Since 2010, there have been around 50 talks in the lecture series Relook, held at One Shanti Road on art history and visual culture, where scholars have presented their recent research for the first time in Bangalore. In 2016, Bangalore artists got to know that the state government was attempting to privatize museums and archaeological monuments under a scheme of adoption, and a private trust would rebuild and rename the Venkatappa Art Gallery, which is the state modern art gallery housing his collections and of other important Karnataka artists like K.K. Hebbar. A group was formed called Venkatappa Art Gallery Forum, the BAG Forum, to represent the artists, and a protest was launched after several meetings. In fact, we've just come from a meeting this afternoon of the Venkatappa BAG Forum, where the newly renovated Venkatappa Art Gallery, which was due to the efforts of the artists of Karnataka. The protests were held at different locations in Bangalore in artistic and creative ways and spread all across Karnataka. The state's intellectuals and cultural figures joined in supporting us. It was a historic protest, unprecedented in India and probably even internationally, where the artists of an entire state came together to protect the commons, which was a democratic space for artists. The Venkatappa Art Gallery became a site for resistance. The artists won and the Tasveer Foundation withdrew from the MOU with the state government after the case got national and international attention. Though the figure of Venkatappa was not directly connected to the protest, he came alive as he was always an anti-establishment figure known for his litigations against the powers that be, in his famous cases against the Mysore Maharaja and Ramakrishna Mission, for instance. So basically, this figure of Venkatappa was kind of lost and lost in the realms of time in a sense, and he was this kind of grandfatherly kind of figure, very eccentric and ascetic kind of but what happened at this time was one started seeing him because of this, as Suresh said, he was also connected to a space. And though the protest did not actually directly refer to the figure of Venkatappa, he was always very independent. He did not brook any kind of insult, and he always had a problem with the authorities. Also, because he saw that how the palace artists was treated, for instance, as against how Ravi Verma was treated. Ravi Verma came from an aristocratic background, and the palace artists were like artisans actually, and he came from that background. So, very, very particular about his kind of standing as an independent artist, and that is also interesting because I think that is what, in a sense, Janaki Nair wrote about this whole thing of how this modern figure, or the figure of the modern artist, came about at that time through the figure of K. Venkatappa. Though he, in fact, when you look at him, he doesn't look modern at all. He wore this dhoti and this Mysore peta and all that, and he was like this kind of old-fashioned sort of figure. Suddenly, the time seemed to be right to have a conference on Venkatappa with the background of the VAG Forum protests. A somewhat forgotten historical figure, he became suddenly contemporary and relevant. He seemed to represent the perennial dilemmas of artists in his life and art. The idea of a national level conference grew into an international one. It took 20 years for this conference to materialize. In those years, Bangalore had become one of the three major centers of contemporary art in the country, along with Mumbai and Delhi. Lively new generations of artists are working and organizing at many levels and form an important presence in the national and international art world. The city is seen as a hub of experimentation. Perhaps the time was right now to examine the past. Now, I'll say a bit about the conference itself, if I'm extending this time. The international conference, held at the same location in the NGMA, was widely attended by artists, academics, and art students, besides many from different fields with several coming from outside the city and thought to be the first of its kind in the region. The opening day of the conference began with a performance in the form of a gallery tour by artist Abhishek Hazra at the Venkatappa Art Gallery, who led the audience through the Venkatappa collection with his artworks and personal memorabilia through the device of a fictional narrative. The work was researched for several months and specially created for the conference. It was a strategic decision to open the seminar with the subjective work of a contemporary artist responding to a historical figure before the presentation of the scholastic papers. Many in the audience were seeing the collection for the first time. The choice of the Venkatappa Art Gallery for the inauguration was also important, as it was recently the venue of the long protest by Karnataka artists to retain it as a public space against the government's decision to give it away in adoption to a private family trust. Venkatappa, always conscious of his historical importance, had wanted his art to be publicly available for viewing, and the state government had built the art gallery to house his works, which were donated by his family. The event moved metaphorically from the public local state space identified with Venkatappa to the National Gallery of Modern Art, caretaker of Indian modernist history, the next day for the presentation of the research papers. The conference was carefully constructed. It began with a broad background and context in which the artist worked, with a keynote address starting from the international vantage point of the Pan-Asian vanguard to which he belonged. The next paper, in contrast, by a sociologist, enumerated the very local context of the modernizing programs of the Mysore state, where Venkatappa came from and benefited by. It went on to more specific details, sources and influences, and analysis of his work, with papers studying his life and art from his own diaries and his important place within the Bengal Renaissance. The early modern phase in Indian art was thoroughly discussed, with a comparative look at his career with that of Ravi Verma, with the early 20th century century landscape painting in Mysore, his use of line in the context of the Indian modern, his bas reliefs and sources of influence, his botanical drawings in connection with science and theosophy, his links to the contemporary romantic movement in Kannada literature, and by comparing his career and dilemmas with the parallel career of the dancer Ram Gopal, his younger contemporary and also a protege of the Mysore king. Thus, the conference dealt with a wide range of contexts and histories from Venkatappa's persona, his patrons, and the very local milieux and practices of his contemporaries, his place in a princely state, to his connection with the nationalist movement, Vivekananda and Nivedita Gandhi, as well as international connections to the movements of theosophy, Orientalism, Pan-Asianism, technical practices, and scientific explorations. These broad references that have been invoked from the very particular to the wider, I believe, are quite unprecedented and excitingly new. There has not been much serious scholarships on Venkatappa. There have been monographs and biographies written by V. Sitaramaya, S. K. Ramchandra Rao, a standard biography by the way which all of us have to study, K. V. Subramaniam, and some interesting essays and articles, all of which we gathered for reference. Much of this has been unexplored material as none of the speakers in the conference had focused on Venkatappa previously. The Bangalore team also had been working since May to compile an archive of publications around him, which are not easily available, and also digitally documenting his letters and diaries in the state archives, which had never been digitized. This material was being sent to the speakers for reference for their research. Thus, Venkatappa was neither ghettoized within Karnataka nor eulogized, but for the first time, a neglected and seminal artistic figure from the state was historically placed within local, national, and international art history. By doing this, we hope to redefine early modern Indian art history itself. One of the delightful touches to the seminar was that performance artist Dimple Shah, who was one of the volunteers for the event, decided to do a performance as Venkatappa on the final day, 27th November 2016. She came dressed as an old Mysore gentleman in K. Venkatappa style and spent the day at the NGMA venue, drawing and writing in notebooks in the garden and sitting silently in the auditorium. So the entire event, which was basically scholastic, began and ended with artist performances. One must mention here that this conference has been special as most of the material on Venkatappa was barely known nationally and mostly unavailable. Since our first meetings, how much time do I have? Since our first meetings in May 2016, we decided to gather an archive of writings about him. Shajana Kaikini in Manipal helped download many publications from secret sites. Raghavendra Kulkarni scanned several publications from the Chitrakala Parishad library and got scans of Venkatappa's letters from the Mysore archive. We got permission from the Venkatappa Trust to use material from his diaries and images of his artworks. Kulkarni sent his student to scan the artist's diaries in the Karnataka State Archive in Vidhan Soda. There were 40 diaries, 40 years of diary writing, which was this kind of gentlemanly activity of the day. And these two students with their cell phones, they, took photographs of each page. Shukla Saban sent her files of images of his works in the Venkatappa Art Gallery. All these materials, there are many of these kind of research that you did, these materials were sent to all the speakers. So each speaker too has done new research and reading to find material for their arguments. Is there a 1 or 2 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. So this is also interesting because we had several discussions after the conference. Many issues came up during and leading up to the conference, which some of us have been discussing at length. Regional modernism. Regional modernism is a term being used widely to talk about different kinds of modern practices away from the modernist centers. This assumes that the center is per se more advanced than the margins. But in many cases, there may be more interesting or avant-garde practices in the outlying centers rather than the mainstream centers. For example, Mysore state was a leader in many areas, like having the first assembly, early industrialization, first to have land reforms and reservations, and ruled by a visionary king, and is yet seen as marginal to Indian history. In the art scene today, um, far more exciting practices may be taking place in margins, whether in non-European countries or in the regions outside the capitals. So, should we use this patronizing term at all? The importance of the movement or group in art history. We've also been discussing about how an art movement becomes so important in art historical studies because it may have a clear manifesto. So that important work, which is not part of a movement, gets left out and becomes marginal. We can apply this to Venkatappa's case, where because he rejected the Bengal school and went away, his work was never properly studied by scholars of the Bengal school. In recent times, a group or movement, even if they had only one show, like Place for People or the Indian Radical Sculptors and Painters group, become a subject of study. While even if there was a great avant-garde feminist rising in art at the same time, with the work of women artists profoundly influencing Indian art practice, it is not studied because it is not a movement with a manifesto. Perhaps it is time to study many important things that are happening at a time, rather than the lazy practice of aggrandizing groups or movements only. Um, When I applied to the India Foundation of the Arts for a grant, I was questioned rigorously about the valorization of a single artist. Studying an individual art practice is not necessarily only about canonizing an artist. Valorizing a group can also canonize the leader, such as F.N. Souza or Hussain of the Bombay Progressives or K.P. Krishna Kumar of the Radicals. By studying an individual artist, one can go deep into the very psyche of the culture and society that shaped him. With the conference on Venkatappa, we looked at his life and practice as emblematic of the dilemmas of his time, an important period in the history of modern India. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Deeptha Achar, who's also the co-editor of this book. Deeptha Achar Deeptha Achar has just retired as professor. Congratulations. Department of English, Faculty of Arts, Maharaja Sayaji Rao University of Baroda, Gujarat. Among the books she has co-edited are Towards New Artistry, Studies in Indian Art 2003, and Articulating Resistance, Art and Activism 2012, apart from the catalogue essays. She is the series editor of the Different Tales series, a multi-language series of illustrated children's books that thematize marginalized childhoods. Recently, she has co-authored an archival show entitled Enlightenment from an Unlikely Envelope, Archives of Adil Jaswala. Her research interests include visual culture studies and childhood studies. Deeptha.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so
Please
much.
switch it on.
Yeah, I don't think it's.
It's not on.
You want to use this?
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you so much, Suresh. And yeah. So, in fact, after Pushpamala's presentation, there's not really very much for me to say. but I will talk a little bit about what it meant to, not kind of, what it meant to uh, transform a seminar into a book. So, how does one actually translate a seminar into a book? Especially a seminar that drew on the political energies of the WAC Forum, uh, which was centered around artists coming together and claiming public space. Uh, and in the context of the energies that were harnessed by the seminar, it's difficult for a much more long drawn out and slower process of bookmaking to actually tap into that kind of excitement. But what transforming a seminar into a book does allow is a kind that very slowness actually. It allows us to think about connections between papers. It allows us to think about newer configurations, how uh, the different entry points, the different ways that one can think about Venkatappa. So, in that sense, I think the book drew a great deal from the energies of the conference, but it also uh, worked on imagining new kinds of connections between the presentations that were made in the seminar itself. So, um, so one our key task, I think, as editors was to kind of look at the kind of configurations that we would like to present as possible entry points into the figure that was K. Venkatappa. So the protests and the new interest in K. Venkatappa, as well as Janki's absolutely pioneering work in thinking about Venkatappa as an artist contributing to the very imagination of Mysore modernity, we find that this kind of um, eh, basically to we try to look at what are the ways in which we can think about a historical figure and yet present him and in the context of the contemporary. So, uh, as we were organizing the uh, chapters into sections, one of the things that we were doing was to look at what are the directions we can take so as to uh, present Venkatappa to a contemporary moment. So, one of the starting points that we set for ourselves is that we are going to work away from an older model of art history which focused on the life and career of the artist. So, we try to move away from the life and works model of an older version of art history. Instead, we looked at Venkatappa. We have tried in this book to look at Venkatappa as a discursive space across whose access we can engage a range of issues. Uh, and the three keywords, nation, region, modernity, are some of the axes along which we try to read the figure of K. Venkatappa. And alongside other words began to emerge, Mysore modernity, but also in the contemporary moment, Karnataka modernity, the national modern, and so on. So as we uh, looked at these ideas, we put together five sections of the book. The first one is called Figuring the Artist, Life and Times. um, where Chandan Gowda, Professor Archip Kumar, Professor Raghavendra Kulkarni have written about uh, the Mysore context in which one can possibly read the artistic trajectory of K. Venkatappa. Um, uh, uh, Professor Kulkarni, for example, he is the person who did most of the archival work, you know, pulling together material from state archives. He, for example, uh, writes about life writing, for example. The second section is called Situating Venkatappa, uh, International Context and National Concerns. And here we kind of widen the ambit, look beyond Mysore, and we also look at the international context that were available to Venkatappa as he found himself in Calcutta. And Partha Mitra's article, for example, discusses the new Pan Asianism that was taking shape during that time, and considering how Venkatappa might have been. Uh, Venkatappa's trajectory might have been construed through such a moment. And Parul Mukherjee and Ajay Sinha also talk about how the nation becomes critical in the way Venkatappa fashioned himself. The next section, colonial modernity and the question of region, we have Professor Nand Kumar, Suresh Jayaram, and Mamta Sagar, who uh, look at not who look at K. Venkatappa in terms of other figures that circulated around, other ideas, music, and so on that circulated alongside Venkatappa's self positioning as an artist. Um, the next section, which is on the fashioning of a modernist idiom, you have Pushpa, who talks about the bas reliefs and how he uses a very modern material, plaster of Paris, in order to uh, articulate a modernizing Mysore uh, princely state. Shrajana Kaikini talks about his engagement with botanical illustration and its relationship to science. And Shukla Sawant talks about uh, uh, his landscapes and how those landscapes are positioned against the kind of landscape um, that the palace artists were producing during that time. Finally, we have two very unusual kinds of uh, articles, not articles actually. Abhishek Hazra, who writes, whose script for the uh, conference, for his performance of the conference, and many people, actually, even our peer reviewers, asked us why should there be such a text in this volume. And I think what our position was that uh, it's a way of offering the contemporary meanings that a turn of the early 20th century artist could have on the present moment. So it kind of offers new ways and new frames with which to look at Venkatappa. And of course, finally, Janki's piece on revisiting, not exactly, as an um, afterward to the book, and where she looks at the current place of art in our times. And I think she can maybe say what, yeah, engage with that. Side by side, we were 2 minutes and I'm done. Side by side, we were faced with the task of framing the volume as a whole. We looked at the symbolic value that uh, Venkatappa had in the present, tying our book to the WAG protests and the establishment of art institutions in Karnataka more broadly. We also drew our some inspiration from the way his life crisscrossed from princely Mysore to uh, Calcutta, which was seething with nationalist ideas, back to Mysore, and from Mysore to Bangalore, and using that as a way of looking at the possible relationship between region and nation. And finally, three directions that our introduction takes. One is an one is the Venkata's deep interest in litigation around the question of art, around the question of commission, around the question of being an artist citizen. So that is one thing that we have explored. Another question that we have looked at is his new interest in spectatorship, particularly after he comes to Bangalore, and his diaries kind of show us how over and over again he reworks his existing artwork in order to be seen differently in different kinds of light and by different kinds of people. I would also finally point out that there are more than 90 images in this book. And I think you may not find so many images of K. Venkatappa in a single place. Yeah, thank you. There is a book on Venkatappa there. Yeah.
Thank you, Deeptha, for the peek into this book, which all of you can buy and read. Now I have the great pleasure of introducing Janaki Nair, my old friend. More than her, I publicly want to announce that her sister was my school teacher. Janaki Nair was professor of history at the Center for Historical Studies, JNU, until retirement in 2020. Her major work has been on Mysore State and Karnataka. Her books include Women and Law in Colonial India, 1996, second revised and updated edition, 2025. Miners and Milllands, Work Culture and Politics of Princely Mysore, 1998, and The Promise of the Metropolis, Bangalore's 20th Century, 2005, I think, which is her most famous book, which also involved Mr. Devegowda holding the book up in public, and which won the New India Foundation Book Prize, and Mysore Modern, Rethinking the Region Under Princely Rule, 2011-2012, an important article which is very much part of this um, conference, is um, Drawing a Line, K. Venkatappa and His Publics, published in 1998, raised new academic interest in the artist who was a bygone figure the time. She worked for some years as the art critic for Deccan Herald in 1980s. Janaki Nair for you.
Can I use the podium?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Pushpa, Deeptha, and Suresh for those extremely warm memories. If the audience will indulge me, I will also go back to say that Pushpa and I actually go back for about 50 years. I know this is revealing our ages, but and the first time, Pushpa, if you don't remember, was when we were both students. You were in Mount Carmel's, I was in St. Joseph's, and we went to Mardi Gras in IIT Madras and entered the collage competition, which of course she won. But there was subsequently a competition for clay modeling, which I won because she didn't enter. So yeah, we go back a long way. She was there when I was, as Suresh just mentioned, uh, drafted to cover the art scene in Bangalore when I was working for Deccan Herald. So perforce, I had to come in contact with artists. I didn't know a thing about art, but I learnt as I went along, and I have not looked back since. So our paths have crossed many times. I don't want to go too much into this nostalgic moment, but it is a bit of nostalgia for me because this article was written so long ago, more than almost 30 years now. And it is really wonderful to return to the city that I've been exiled from for about 30 years, to know that there is such engagement with what was written so long ago. So I welcome the kind of attention it has received, not just by the people who have spoken just now, but also by those who've contributed to this book. What I thought I'd spend my time, I've been told 15 minutes. I'll try and stay within 15. What I thought I'd spend my time doing today, because I'm aware that probably most of this audience has not actually read that article, is to give you a sense of what the excitement of a historian is when she encounters this extraordinarily lush archive. And of course, it was a serendipitous discovery in the private paper section of the Karnataka State Archives. Incidentally, for those of you who are embarking on a career in history, let me tell you that there is a very, very rich collection of private papers in the Karnataka State Archives, and it's very little used. One of the things that actually struck me, apart from these 40 diaries, which I'm going to say a word about in just a minute, is the meticulous way in which this figure had actually documented his life almost in preparation for a sort of consecration as the first modern artist of Mysore. And I'll say a bit more about this as well in just a moment. But it seemed like from the very start, when he went as a scholarship student to the Calcutta School of Art in 1909 and stayed there for 7 years, he was aware of this greater destiny, or rather, he worked for this greater destiny, including in the way in which he meticulously filed his letters, answers to letters he received, and of course, his diary. So, the diary, for those of you who are interested, was written entirely in English. There are a few entries in Kannada, but by and large, it is written in English. This is itself something of interest to us for someone who is living and working in the 20th century at a time when the nationalist movement was at its height and where Kannada consciousness was also at its height. So when I interviewed Nittur Srinivas Rao for my Bangalore book, he told me that they started a movement in which people were fined for speaking in English so that they would be encouraged to speak and write in Kannada. So there had to be a self-conscious way of propagating the language. But here was this man writing his diary in English, again with this sense of self which saw him as destined for something greater than just the region. He signed in Kannada in some of his paintings, and the link between writing and signature we can perhaps even talk about later. What I was interested in doing as a historian and not as a trained art historian was to look at the intersections or the links between art forms and social formation. So, how is this figure emerging? What is his trajectory? In some ways, you could say what I wrote was biographical, but in some ways, it was also trying to set up an idea of what was Mysore and how is this extraction from the palace artist stage happening in a way that propels him in a completely different direction at a time of growing anti colonial nationalism, not least in the realm of the aesthetic. And of course, where else was this aesthetic being pioneered but in Calcutta? So, of course, it is to Calcutta that he goes, but there is a sense of self which is cultivated by Venkatappa, which includes the cultivation of famously what he called aparigraha, which is a certain kind of austerity. And these are the three features of his life, really: a certain kind of austerity, a celibacy, and of course, memorable eccentricities, excessive litigiousness, and so on and so forth. So the austerity was obsessive. And you can immediately understand that he was a complete misfit in this Bengali setting, the Dakshineer veranda, where these extremely upper caste and upper class artists would be reclining or resting, but also partook of a fish and meat. That was one of his horrors that he had to ask when he went to Darjeeling with these artists for a separate place to stay, because he couldn't bear the thought of meat and fish being cooked in the same kitchen from which he ate. So he had a really difficult time coming to terms with the classness and the upper casteness of this very privileged group of Jarashanko. And nevertheless, he lasted because he obviously found it as an important way of relinquishing, in some ways, his caste capital in favor of something else: the world of modern art, the exposure that it gave him, the kinds of opportunities that it gave him to be included in various kinds of books, which became both national and international sellers. So this consciousness of himself as an artist, and those who have looked at his diaries know that he was very, very conscious of distancing himself from the category of artisan. He wanted to define himself as an artist. He is not an artisan. He is a modern artist, and he has a sense, an artistic ego in some ways, which is, classically something that distinguishes the modern artist from his forebears. He is, however, and his training in Bengal and all the praise that he got for the way in which he learned the new nationalist aesthetic that was being pioneered in the Bengal region, and in particular the Calcutta School of Art, was something that he also distanced himself with. So he did not become, when he returned to Mysore, a retailer of the national modern aesthetic that Abanindranath had actually developed. Abanindranath and his students had, and his disciples, I should say, had developed. It was at the same time that he refuses the medium of oil, which had been so effectively used by Ravi Varma. And again, there's a distancing of himself from that kind of modernity as well. So there is a distancing from the national modern that is coming up in the Calcutta setting. There is a distancing from the Ravi Varma kind of realistic, portrayals that are naturalistic portrayals that were very much appreciated both in Baroda and in Mysore by the palace, and so on. So he's coming back to Mysore, I would say hesitantly, but also triumphantly, because he is returning in some ways to the safer environs of the palace. But in what he does when he returns is that he completely resets the terms on which he relates to his principal patrons, who are no doubt the Wadiyars themselves. At first, he asks for to be sent to Europe for training in sculpture. So he wants to make a move away from painting to sculpture. and due to the war, it is unfortunate he was not able to go. But I don't think also Mirza was in a mood to indulge him, having spent so much time and money on him in, being trained in Calcutta. Later on, he turns to the Veena, and this is something that has been written about as well by Nandakumar, because he realized that the Veena artists of the Mysore Palace, of course, nearly all of them being Brahmins, were much higher regarded than the palace artists. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but he certainly saw this as something that will help him to redefine himself, to escape, as it were, the category of Chitragara, and to become, as it were, something more important. And that's the context in which he writes this, paints this work, Mad After Veena, which became the most sort of iconic work of his, partly because it was remembered, and partly because his mentor, Abanindranath Tagore, to whom he sent this image, was severely critical. And he said, you may be mad after Veena or any other thing, but you shouldn't sacrifice your artistic qualities to produce something which clearly Abanindranath Tagore was not impressed with. So he has, in some ways, and then Mirza, who is, of course, the one who's mediating his terms within the palace, is trying to push him in the direction of being more productive. He asks him, for example, to make portraits of landscapes of the city, which he is unable to do. He produces one landscape of the city of Mysore, but otherwise he turns in the 1920s to this extraordinary genre, which becomes very, very popular, of landscape painting, located in Ooty first and then in Kodaikanal. Now, what ensures his place in the Mysore setting is in fact not the artists, and is not in fact even the palace or the commissions of the palace, but it is the literary sphere. The literary sphere takes him up. It is people like Kuvempu, Shivaram Karanth, R.R. Divakar, Sita Ramaya, who's already been mentioned, B.M. Shri, and so on and so forth, who actually promote him by using some of his images as illustrations in their printed work. And he was extremely meticulous and particular about how his work should be understood. And so, for instance, you have this long discussion about whether the image should be subordinate to text, and should his work actually be used only as illustration, or should it have some kind of standalone weight. There were many of these discussions which he had, obviously, with these literatures. He was a very difficult man, as I've already said. He was extremely litigious. That has already been mentioned by several. He took the Ramakrishna Mission to court because they had printed his picture of Rama giving Hanuman the signet ring in the wrong direction. He took them to court, and he won the case also. For he had the symbolic victory of 1 rupee, which the judge himself was astonished by and thought he had, wasted the court's time and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, what I'm saying is that he made his mark through his a certain kind of preciousness that he developed about himself. Whether he was speaking to these literatures or whether he was speaking to collectors like Treasurywala from Bombay, who would commission him to write or draw certain things, and there would be these fierce arguments about what colors he should use and so on and so forth. He felt he should not be dictated to on those grounds. And it is the landscapes that actually draw a lot of attention, and it draws the attention of even people who know nothing about art, people like Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, for instance, and who later on, of course, she becomes the person in charge of the arts and crafts ministry, and then she is trying to urge him to sell his work to the ministry and so on, which he refuses. But anyway, all that is in the article. I just thought I'll give you a sort of thumbnail sketch of the kinds of things that this archive allows us to look at and to talk about at this time. Unlike what we imagine, he's not actually so concerned about the national movement. We don't see him discussing even, first of all, you don't see him discussing any other artist's work. You don't see him discussing the nation at all. And August 15th, 1947, for somebody who's a copious diarist, is just dismissed in one line. So, he's not someone who's really seeing himself as making this passage to the post colonial in any significant way, except that he is unceremoniously turfed out of the palace. In 1940, he begins this long case against the Maharaja and loses, and therefore he establishes himself in Bangalore. But there are two interesting aspects of his life that we can and retrieve as a way of thinking about how he saw himself as the harbinger of modernity. One is that he stopped selling his work after 1926 because he decided by then that this work should be collected and made available to posterity in a location. So he already had this vision. I mean, the museum came up only after he died, but he already had this vision of his collection being made available to people in the future. And of course, as I said, he extensively, and as I think Deeptha has mentioned, he extensively reworked his works in the last stages of life. He wasn't doing anything new at all. He was just reworking. But his artistic genius, and to the extent that he sort of establishes himself as an artistic genius, is not only in the art, it's also in the courtroom. So, the courtroom becomes very important for him to establish his artistic genius. And that's why the cases are actually quite important as well. Okay, let me leap forward. I don't know how many minutes I've used up of my 15 minutes to say, what is the status and importance of Venkatappa today? And that's what I think I've tried to do in what was called the afterword, what is called the afterword in this book, which is, we know from what little I have told you so far, that the state was a very important entity for K. Venkatappa. Whether you see it as the state as represented by the Mysore Palace, or whether you see the state as the democratic state that comes up in the post-independence period. It was important, and of course it has assumed importance because it is the state that officially consecrated him as the first modern artist. I don't think there is any other state in the Indian Union which has established a museum, correct me if I'm wrong, in the name of one of their local artists. And it happened very early in the 1970s. It is the state that recognizes him. He wanted that state recognition and so on. I don't think he actually worked for it, but it happened. What is the status of the state in today's art milieu? That's the question that I think we need to also ask, because we have transited, I think, from a world of art that is represented by a figure like Venkatappa, an art world, to what is very definitely an art market. I mean, we were told a little earlier that Bangalore is competing with Bombay and Delhi, and I think the market is a very, very important feature of this reconfiguring of the national on the art front, for which we need to ask ourselves, why is the state even important anymore in actually cultivating art or promoting art at a time when the market is so dominant, and where the market is in fact defining so many aspects of art production, art making, and art pedagogy. It is also defining exhibitionary norms, and it's also defining museum spaces and museum practices. All of these have been transformed by the actions of the market. Somebody who is you can't even use the word avant-garde artist for Venkatappa, because even though there are some aspects of his life and his persona and his sense of self that clearly saw himself as part of this modern, which is to say that he refused, as Pierre Bourdieu famously talks about, the anti-economic economy of the avant-garde. And in some ways, he anticipates the anti-economic economy by as I said, the refusal to sell his work after 1926, and so on and so forth. So clearly, Venkatappa was addressing an anonymous public in the future. Let me also add here that he was somebody who completely refused to set up a studio where he would engage with students. Many people wrote to him asking him to be their guide in art, but he refused to be a teacher. He did not teach art to anybody. That was one very clear aspect of his life that he stuck to. So he was clearly addressing and working for this future audience or public of which he had no real conception. And I think today he would definitely not have envisaged the rise of a certain kind of plebeian democracy where groups have emerged very actively in our public sphere who have revealed a capacity for politics in spite of. So, we are increasingly hearing, for instance, that X or Y group has protested against this or that film or book or painting or artwork or whatever it is, even if they have not necessarily been acquainted with it or with its production. This is our moment. This is our democratic moment. And, I think the book is in some ways addressing some of the questions related to Venkatappa in the historical, but also brings us to this contemporary, partly because of the circumstances under which this book has taken root. But it locates Venkatappa in this very rich milieu. And I would say the book is actually just is an inaugural moment, because we need to grapple with some of the questions that I say we have not perhaps dealt with in our struggle to keep the Venkatappa Art Gallery as something that is part of the state's domain. I mean, we need to think about what it is that's at stake here at a time of such dramatically transformed certain circumstances where what is the stage at which we are at in terms of art practice, in terms of museum going, and in terms of critical audiences. These are questions we need to ask, and I believe the book has set the pace for asking some of these questions. But with this, I say once more, thank you for acknowledging my work after so many years, engaging with it, and allowing me this opportunity to contribute as well as to speak here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Janaki, for the very passionate speech on Venkatappa and relooking at what you wrote, which was also part of our art history course, and again writing the last piece which is there in this book. I think there's lots of work to be done in terms of the regional modern as we look at it today. Pleasure of introducing my friend Ashish Rajadhyaksha, who is an independent scholar. He is an author of A Return of... But it will be interesting to know that Venkatappa saw a lot of films which we all don't know.
Yes.
Yeah, A Return of the Epic, Hong Indian cinema in the time of celluloid from Bollywood to the Emergency 2009, the last cultural mile in... Let people know who don't know you also. The last cultural mile in inquiry into technology and governance in India, 2011, and John Tarkovsky, Citizens Filmmakers, Hackers, 2023, an editor of Encyclopedia of Indian Cinema with Paul Willman. I think it's your most significant book for all of us. In the wake of Aadhaar, the digital ecosystem of governance in India, 2013, and the book of Kumar Sani's writings, The Shock of Desire and Other Essays, 2015. He has curated with Geeta Kapoor the Bombay Mumbai 1992-2001 sector of Century City, section of Century City, Art and Culture in the Modern Metropolis, State Modern, 2001. Memories of Cinema in the exhibition Meta Question, Back to the Museum Passé at the Guangzhou Triennale 2011. You Don't Belong, a festival of independent documentary, video and fiction in Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou and Kunming in 2011. Make Belong, films in Kochi from China, and Hong Kong, Kochi Majlis Binale 2015, and Dunia Pachayon Ki Archila Gallery, which is ongoing in 2025. He was one of the founders of CSCS, Center for Study of Culture and Society in Bangalore. Ashish.
Thanks, Suresh. I just cut and pasted that CV. I could have probably used the time differently. Anyway, first of all, thanks very much for the book. Thanks for organizing this, and thanks for inviting me. I do not speak as anything like an authority on the subject of this evening's topic. And I think that in itself is going to be important to what I'm going to talk about. I mean, I did not know very much about Venkatappa. I think the first time I heard the name also was in the context of the art gallery. And the second time I heard the name was when I was reading Janaki's essay, which was at that time, you remember, published as an occasional paper. And I read it when you were in Madras at that time. And I have to confess that I read it not with an interest in Venkatappa, but with an interest in Janaki. I was interested at that time in the kinds of new methodologies that historians were bringing to bear, partly because we were doing the Encyclopedia of Indian Cinema and we were looking at material that not only had itself not been looked at before, but we're looking at new ways by which we might be able to look at it. Before this happened, before this kind of new interest in those kinds of materials happened, I guess I was, growing up in the 80s in Bombay and going to the Jahangir Art Gallery week after week, kind of, shall we say, bored by, exhausted by, and disinterested in Indian modernism, barring a certain set of artists whom one had exceptionalized. I remember M.F. Hussain sort of famously saying that no artist in India before independence was of any significance to him except Amrita Shergill. And they would make an occasional exception with someone like Rabindranath, but generally, pre-progressive artists group, there was really nothing of interest. And I think one grew up with that kind of thinking. I do not know if Venkatappa would have, on his own, interested me very much. Strangely, this is a kind of position on Indian modernism that Geeta Kapoor actually supports. And she actually says in one point in When Was Modernism that it is possible to argue that Indian artists have only now, and when she says now, she's writing in 1992, only now become modern in what is characterized as the postmodern age. She says, I mean this in the sense of being able to confront the new without inevitably flying to the defense of tradition, when you could talk about the new without talking about tradition, being able to cope with the autonomy of cultural atomization by invoking and inverting notions of romantic affiliation. That is to say, to actually speak of the mythology of indigenous community and the lost continent of an exile, in a way that can allow for identity politics to take new forms and shapes. In that sense of the modern, we probably didn't have a modernism before the 90s. This is an argument that many have made, and Perry Anderson, I think, at one point speaks about the fact that modernism could be so variously defined that you could actually speak of places in Europe that probably never encountered it. It's a highly it's a shifting target, as it were. Today, my position on this is quite different. I think you can actually look at these earlier modernist histories with a degree of intensity and a degree of interest that I do not think I had when I was growing up in Bombay at that time. I think there are new methodologies that have emerged, and I think this particular book is an absolutely great example of those new methodologies that have emerged. And there are new technologies, digital technologies that are now available, including the mobile phone, I think, with which those diaries were captured, which weren't available in the 80s, which are giving us that history in a certain way, and a certain, not only the material there, but a certain perspective seems to be available to us that gives us this kind of vision of history. I think there are two aspects to this particular way by which we look at history, and I think the book bears shows that those methodologies. One is when you start looking at the art that came from then to now as bearing witness to that epoch. It's an art that emerges at a time and is about that time in ways that one had not kind of imagined. And in that also emerges an idea of an artist as a subjective being, as a being capable of an unconscious, capable of dreams, desires, fantasies, in the sense in which, I don't know, Freud talked about Leonardo, as an artist who had a certain condition of consciousness. I mean, it's an argument that I often had with Ghulam Sheikh, who talk about, I don't know, Gangarama Sahibuddin, or the Mughal painters, and he would say, now we know all about them, and one thing was, do they have an unconscious? Do they have a subjective condition? And at what point of time did this particular subjective condition of an artist's subjectivity emerge in India? Was it Abhinandannath that did it? Now what is happening is that with someone like Venkatappa, we're actually encountering a new kind of subject position, which I think is getting interesting and significant. So it is from this kind of perspective that what I thought I'd do is I would pick a few sections from the book and quote from them and comment on them to talk about the kind of new questions, you might say, that emerge. The first is continuing this idea of the artistic persona, the artist as a subject. Something we haven't really discussed. You remember, for example, Raymond Williams' entry in Keywords on artists. Who is an artist and what is an artist? I will be challenging later on in this the kind of category distinction between artist and artisan, which clearly Venkatappa took very seriously, as Janaki points out, suggesting that actually the distinction is probably not very much, if at all. We'll be coming to that in a moment. On the one hand, before that happens, there is a certain, almost like a 3-part, maybe 4-part division that Venkatappa seems, going by the book, to be split into. One is, of course, the idea of the individual genius, and he did see himself as a genius, unencumbered by history. So you have this incredible letter that he writes to Jayaram cousins, as quoted by Sajjana Kaikini, where he says that he is not influenced by Mughal and Rajput schools, that he says, I am known for my individuality since about 3 decades. I presume you are not aware of the fact that I was born, so to speak, with a brush of colors, since my father and grandfather both were great artists of their own times, and so my technique is not a copied one, or one in which both Mughal and Rajput schools are combined, as you have erroneously pointed out. This is a kind of very interesting claim that I think emerges with a certain kind of modernism, that I'm thoroughly original. I am influenced by nobody. I'd like to track the genealogy of that sort of claim as well. So on the one hand, there was this idea of him being this individual genius unencumbered by history, but at the same time, there was this thing about him being a representative of princely Mysore, but in a way that moved him away from being a traditional Chitragar and into a condition of modernity without clarity as to what was the aesthetic of that modernism, or the modernism that went with that modernity. Then there was the discomfiting aspects of the national modern, already pointed out by Janaki, and the confusions around what that was and what 15th of August 1947 may have meant to him at all. And lastly, then, the complications around what the nation itself was that he wanted to or didn't want to belong to. In the introduction, the editors, Pushpa and Deeptha, actually talk about some of these things. They talk about how Venkatappa self-positioned in Mad After Veena as a melancholic, distracted figure, laid claim to a lineage of the modern creative genius. Now, this is an interesting one, that why a melancholic, distracted figure would lay claim to being a modern creative genius. At the same time, he equally can be seen as laying claim to a nationalist, almost Gandhian ascetic figure, say the editors, both in his self-portrayal as the yogi mold, as well as in his choice of the thin washes of the early Swadeshi style of the Bengal school. This particular kind of modernism allowed him, they say, to find a way around his caste status as an artisan, marked by somewhat lowly status as a palace artist, and consolidated status as a modern artist in the new India. But what was the new India? That was the question. The introduction goes on. It says that he wanted to consolidate his status as a preeminent artist in Karnataka. Yet, in real terms, we find that he hardly spends time expanding his oeuvre and creative practice. From being at the center of the nationalist art scene in his days as a young artist in Calcutta, surrounded by extraordinarily influential mentors and peers, he chose to return to the nationally significant but provincial outpost of Mysore. This then is a contradiction in terms. I mean, what then is where is the aspiration in a sense? I mean, what historically would make sense within this condition that he finds himself in? This is something that actually Nandakumar, who writes the most, shall we say, contrarian essay in the book, really goes into. I mean, Nandakumar is very critical of Venkatappa. And he says, quite often, Venkatappa's creative faculties seem to be hamstrung and his creative drive encumbered by the indecisive tug between pride and shame, induced by an all-pervasive, all-consuming self-consciousness. This kind of overarching self-consciousness appears to stifle his creativity, says Nandakumar. Dry up the well springs of the creative frenzy and do not allow the mind to let go of its defensive inhibitions that masquerade as moral restraints. Now, this is pretty deadly. He says that about Venkatappa, that this is the problem that he had. In short, says Nandakumar, what Venkatappa was claiming in the name of freedom was not freedom at all. His mind, Anandakumar adds, hardly ever experienced the kind of freedom from its self-imposed codes of conduct to loosen the reserves of creative impulse and surrender himself to a state of mind free from the trammels of common sense rationality and instrumental causality. This, I think, leads to a very curious statement that the editors make, which I really found very interesting. Venkatappa surely looked to litigation as one of the processes by which he could establish the persona of an unworldly artist, as the platform where he could situate his claims to artistic worth. Now, I cannot think of anything more worldly than litigation. I mean, why would you find unworldly, personae through litigation? That was an interesting one. And I think that this is a kind of problem that defines this particular sort of subjectivity. Shivakumar goes on to add that his decision to embrace aparigraha, and I did not know the word aparigraha until Suresh told me a little bit about it in brief conversation. Yeah, I mean, it's not a term that I've come across really. Total self-reliance, and to study music from the same master as the Maharaja was symptomatic of his deep desire, writes Shivakumar, albeit unconscious, to be acknowledged as a unique and absolute individual, different from all the other court artists and musicians who belong to an older artisanal tradition and become then an equal citizen of a modern state. Moreover, when this did not happen, exercising his citizenry rights, he sought legal redress by taking the Maharaja himself to court. This was already mentioned earlier. Which then leads the question about being, what kind of a nation would a national artist be in this particular context? What kind of subjective situation then would this kind of figure want to be part of? Shivkumar sets up a couple of fairly classic tropes, again, which are very familiar. One is, of course, the fact that you could really only be a national artist in Bengal, which is something that we've all known about with friends in Calcutta. That, the famous line that someone said that provincializing Europe was actually globalizing Bengal. It was actually a certain claim that Bengal-based social scientists often make, and Shivkumar actually says this. He says the artists in Bengal lived under direct colonial rule and saw their work as part of the nationalist anti-colonial struggle. Their freedom in Bengal lay in shaping an alternate modernity realized through the establishment of an independent artistic sphere, in opposition to institutional frameworks established by the colonial rulers. In contrast, says Shivkumar, Mysore couldn't have done that. It wasn't possible for historic reasons of why Mysore couldn't do it. Mysore, says Shivkumar, was a princely state under British suzerainty, and the Maharaja exercised symbolic power through cultural patronage and gift giving, And the palace served the dual role of re-articulating older kingly traditions and reinterpreting colonial modernity within a local context. This was what Venkatappa inherits, says Shivkumar in this book. This allowed Venkatappa to see himself both as a loyal subject who sought palace patronage and a sovereign citizen who sought legal rights. For him, modernity meant sovereignty and artistic autonomy predicated on individual freedom. This defines what Shivkumar uses. And it's a word I've been very, very fascinated about, is ambivalence. It's a term that one takes from Homi Bhabha. I don't know if Shivkumar meant it quite like that, but he talks about ambivalences as extremely significant. And I think we have not adequately discussed the historical status of ambivalent situations. In his life and art, Shivkumar writes, in his life and art, in trying to negotiate between tradition and modernity, Venkatappa reflected the same ambivalence that the princely state of Mysore itself did, displayed while negotiating between the colonial government and the nationalist ambitions brewing around it. Now, this is of some significance, I think, and in the way that this particular, shall we say, political ambivalence translates into a performative and eventually subjective ambivalence. It is something that Janaki Nair actually speaks of in Mysore Modern. And Mysore Modern, there's a chapter in which I can actually read, this particular situation. She talks about the way that Kuvempu and R.R. Divakar, I quote her, knocked on the studio doors of K. Venkatappa for help in defining a unique Kannada aesthetic. And in the afterword, which again she gave us a little summary of, she talks about the fact that neither did Venkatappa actively collaborate in visualizing the Kannada nation or allegorizing its historical part. One might even say that he shunned history, turning instead to the nourishing myths of the Hindu pantheon of most of his artistic productions. So there's, she says almost like a denying of the possibility of his recuperation within the space of an emerging Kannada identity. The Kannada intellectuals seem to intrude into the artist's life, says Janaki, disturbing and delaying the genius at work. But this is what's of interest, and this is the kind of twist that you get in Janaki's, both in the afterword here as well as in the essay that she writes. Yet the fact that there is no evidence of the artist's overt links with questions of Kannada identity or the broader national movement need not be taken as the absence of the political in the formation of his artistic sensibility, which is where I think the question arises. How then do you read politics in someone who so resolutely stops you from doing so? What's the consequence of it? In fact, I think what Janaki also mentions is that one of the ways in which this whole protest, the Venkatappa, the Bag Forum protest and so on, kind of returns Venkatappa into a political space, and the way that this book does it is actually to finish an unfinished question in his own life and time. It's a question that, again, Suresh mentioned in your opening remarks. Venkatappa himself might have protested. He might have said, this is not me, or he might have not have liked, I don't know what he would have said about this particular book. I want to conclude this with some of the questions around art itself. I want to say a little bit about Ravi Verma. Now, it is true that Ravi Verma is princely and Venkatappa is from the low caste. But having said that, the question that Shivkumar talks about in this thing about princely states and their compromised relationships, you might say, with colonial systems, it does seem that Ravi Verma offers a very different option, and it is one that Venkatappa is very interested in, but cannot quite get. So why Venkatappa cannot be a Ravi Verma is a question that I think the book actually spends time on. So Shivkumar, for example, says that, it's true that, again, as the introduction by Pushpa and Deeptha talk about, that the Telugu-speaking Chitragaras of the palace were skilled in traditional painting, including portraiture and gold leaf work, as was Venkatappa's father. However, in the late 19th and early 20th century, particularly after Ravi Verma, there was a noteworthy turn to oil as a favored and elite medium that could represent a modernizing state, and a significant interest in the possibilities offered by photography. But Shivkumar talks about yet another medium, which I think is interesting, that he says that as a painter, he was trained in the new indigenous manner suited for small format works, but was keen on doing something on the scale of a Ravi Verma. This is Shivkumar writing in the book. In keeping with this ambition, he had drawn up a plan for decorating the Amma Villa's hall as early as 1916, immediately after returning from Calcutta, but then chose to use plaster of Paris. And Shiv Kumar says plaster of Paris was a very odd medium to use for large reliefs, but it gave Venkatappa the scope to do something that could be compared with the paintings that Ravi Verma had done for the Maharaja, both in scale and subject matter. He put himself into this project with great meticulousness, but refused to be rushed, just as he reserved the right to choose his subjects as an assertion of artistic independence. Nandakumar makes yet another argument around this question of music, where again, I mean, he really gives Venkatappa a hard time, I have to say. He says that something arbitrary and unconvincing about the self-professed and self-avowed stances he takes in vindication of his predilection for music. It is more than a touch of being a little too overstated and overstretched, where one is less sure of oneself. You have to get credentialed, with the music and musical tropes and musical figures and world of musical appreciation of understanding, which could be expected. I'll end my last point is about this question of the artisan. I read Arindam Datta's book, many of you would know it, called The Bureaucracy of Beauty, with enormous interest, because Arindam Datta actually makes an entirely different relationship of the role of artisans within colonial modernity, colonial modernism. He really sort of largely debunks the distinction then between a modern artist and a traditional artisan, suggesting that the distinction is largely a false one. I quote him. He says, the colonial artisan epitomized the anthropological armature on which notions of British imperial responsibility turned. As a figure of difference, the artisan does not disappear with the advent of British individualism. It appears within it. It appears within it. The imago of the Oriental artisan is born and bred in the anthropological chrysalis of industrial capitalism. And you'll see this today when you get artisanal chocolates, for example. Or you'll get, the whole thing about the use of artisanal as a design feature that you get today, I think speaks of a very different career of artisanal practice. And so if you start looking at this kind of artisan and the inability, I mean, if at all Arindam Datta is right, and if this kind of redefinition, repositioning of the artisan as being not something that you can move away from by becoming a modern artist, if that's a false distinction, then I think it also throws a little bit of light on both the material and the subjective crises that someone like Venkatappa, I'm done, that someone like Venkatappa actually incarnates. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. I think Ashish referred to two very significant essays by Nandakumar and Ashish Kumar, which I urge all of you all to read, because it really rips Venkatappa apart. And not many of us do it because we look at him with awe, but at the same time, it's fascinating to read what they've written to us today in this book. Our last speaker today is Sherin. Sherin is an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and India Studies at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. The scholarship centers on decolonial perspectives and critically rethink modernity, nation, and regional literatures through interdisciplinary engagement with literature, arts, and cinema. Her work explores nuanced world-making and the complexities of national narratives within the post-colonial and feminist frameworks. As exemplified in her monograph, Gendering Minorities, Muslim Women and the Politics of Modernity, Orient Black Swan. Sherin.
Thank you very much, Deeptha and Pushpamala and Suresh for giving me this opportunity. When I stand here and as I'm about to read my paper, I'm also thinking it's not a paper like present my views on the book. I'm also thinking probably I'm the kind of outsider here. I don't belong to Karnataka, or like I'm not familiar with the artwork of Venkatappa as a native, like, somebody who's from Karnataka. And again, like, a lot more. My introduction to the work of this great artist is primarily, like, in fact, I noticed this artist through Janaki's essay, and then later that. I would really appreciate that kind of protest that came up in connection with the art gallery's future. So that's when I kind of came to know that there is this kind of an artist existing in modern India. And yeah, therefore, like, I don't know, like, how far I am kind of. I can speak on this artist with that kind of an authority. But thank you very much. And obviously, like, my interest in this work, like, I can enter this whole field of work only through two kind of positions that connects my research with this body volume of work. One is the question of imagining, like, the idea of world making, and then the other idea of, like, the presence of religion in terms of thinking about modernity, the contested forms of modernity that we can imagine. Yeah, and thank you, Janki, for reminding us that the historian's archive is fragmented and contested. And there's also the weight of what remains unwritten about it. So, and again, for Ashish, for complicating the what this idea of national modernity itself. Yeah, so the kind of invitation that both these interventions extend, I would like to kind of push this further and kind of take a somewhat different kind of launch, which I think is also truly at stake in the book, like, particularly for somebody who enters it from the perspective I elaborated earlier. Uh, okay, sorry. For me, like, how studying Venkatappa's work would take you to understand the diverse origins, or the, as we are talking in terms of a decolonial framework, the non Eurocentric forms of modernity, obviously. And particularly when we attend to what I would call a post secular world making or imagination, a kind of worlding practice that is happening in this collection of work that this artist presents. What I propose probably is to think of this as an instance of a post secular kind of worlding, the creation of an artistic world where, you have the spiritual, the sacred and the secular, the traditional and the modern, regional and national. It remains it remain entangled. And So if you look at the book, the editors themselves claim about the political stakes as they write. The volume also valuably offers a model how to engage with the lives and legacies of the pioneering figures of the past in a manner. I'm not audible still. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yes. The volume also valuably offers a model of how to engage with the lives and legacies of pioneering figures of the past in a manner that's both a necessary corrective, and that is both a necessary corrective and a critical celebration. But more specifically, what draws me into this idea of other ways of thinking about the nation and region would be what Sumati Ramaswamy notes in her endorsement of the book. She says nation region modernity deftly demonstrates how the nation lives in and through the region, but also frequently at the expense of the region. This formulation is, for me, a very crucial way of understanding the book, and also to kind of elaborate the process of worlding that I'm talking about. The nation does not exist apart from the region, but it is constituted and reconstituted through regional practices, aesthetics, worldviews. Yet, this constitutive role often goes unrecognized. And even as regional specificity is absorbed into the nationalist frameworks. And typically, like, coming to the idea of Mysore modern, this is exactly what is elaborated in Janki's work also of Mysore modern as a kind of pluriversal idea of worlding. For instance, Janki argues that we must understand a specifically regional monarchical modern moment in Indian history. This is not incomplete modernity, but rather an autonomous world making project. So the artist who engages with this kind of a world making project acknowledges the idea of many worlds that can simultaneously exist. Modernization without that secular aspirations of the nationalist framework, something that particular kind of modernization, which is also an aspirational modernization in the post-independence framework. And in this kind of a larger frame of nationalist moment or nationalist aspiration, the idea of religion, the idea of the sacred, that was also, like, in some ways central to, or like, that was the point of contestation to state legitimacy. But what had to flourish was also the question of the cosmopolitan, the progressive, the reform, which was taken up and, like, promoted. And precisely, like, I'm also looking at Ajay Sinha's essay here on Mysore Modern, which is particularly illuminating because it shows how multiple artistic registers kind of illuminate the work of this author. Through the figure of this dancer Ram Gopal, he shows how Mysore produced what he calls a cosmopolitan modernism through hybrid vocabularies. And so somebody who experiments with multiple forms of dance and movement, and created something which could not be reduced to a single tradition. And when this was photographed, as Sinha writes, it was not only representing Indian dance forms, but also freely interpreting his training using costumes, ornaments, and styles that cannot be traced to a single tradition in India. So this process of bringing in many forms, many kind of traditions into a single kind of articulation, it's a creation of a distinctive modernity rooted in place, yet open to global intellectual and artistic currents, without requiring the erasure of religious or sacred or code based patronage structures. Doesn't have to be like patronized by secular institutions, like, or so-called modern state, as it comes up later. Similarly, when we look at this essay on Old Mysore, a milieu for an artist, this keeps coming back again. How Mysore cultivated a progressive environment where modernization proceeded through regional channels. It was not simply imported from Bengal or Europe, but created in conversation with very place-specific genealogies of patronage, aesthetic traditions, and philosophical inquiry. And this is the world in which Venkatappa emerged, and his diaries, essay, and particularly this essay on his diaries, reveals an artist caught between multiple worlds that increasingly came into conflict. And on one side, you can see this conflict as his desired autonomy from court patronage, while being entirely shaped by it. So that kind of tension. On one side, there is this aspiration for autonomy, but at the same time, this is also an artist who's entirely patronized by the court patronage. He wanted to belong to the pan-Indian nationalist aesthetics. We can say that probably, but while remaining stubbornly regional, he was like, not willing to leave that regional aspirations at all. So these are actually not, you won't say this is a personal individual tension. I see it as the lived contradictions of navigating plural worlds simultaneously. And the Shadanga project, it also, in some way, I feel, is emblematic of this kind of a worlding or a post-secular project where his collaboration with, on one side, there is the collaboration with Abhinandanand Tagore. So if you think about the Shadanga a little more, most of you might know about this more than me. So the six limbs of Indian painting. Obviously, there is this lineage from the Sanskrit aesthetic treatises, but there is a kind of artistic practice that talks about kind of a participation in the cosmic order, a sacred knowledge, but it's also kind of a participation in a sacred knowledge embedded in, sacred forms that we kind of connect with temple architecture, devotional pedagogy, and all that. When this anatomy or this whole project of illustrating the Shadanga anatomy began, the idea was to what Habermas would call translation of religious knowledge into a very modern kind of pedagogical form. That was the aspirational kind of the takeoff for the project. Uh, so. In that sense, Parul's essay on the anatomy lessons from Shadanga. So here, like, it explores this project meticulously. But what is striking here is this translation, translation of the religious, the sacred, the spiritual into the modern format. It's not seamless, obviously. You can see the beautiful kind of comparative line drawings, parrot beaks with human noses, conch shells with necks. It also in some ways gestures towards something more than an empirical observation. It's also like, for somebody who's reading literary metaphors in, like, old regional writings, particularly Malayalam, I come across this comparison between the conch shell and the neck of the god. Quite often it comes in a very complex kind of metaphorical elaboration. So what I'm trying to say is the enchanted world of what you call the pre-modern experience, where there is a natural participation of forms in this divine order that always is invoked in these kind of metaphorical representations. So even when you aspire to create a modern form for a very a kind of sacred imagination, whether how far the artist is able to achieve it, or what are the kind of mediations and negotiations happening there, that's also something which is very interesting for us to look at. So in that sense, I look at this as a very interesting post-secular a body of work that would help you to enter into this, like, a perspective or a post-secularism as a kind of vantage point that you can use to enter the this body of artwork. So, and in some ways, you take these texts, and it's also an attempt to, and particularly that's what this book is doing for me, trying to make the aesthetic knowledge, which has a very nuanced kind of origin, not properly what you call secular, not so-called modern, but it is also trying to bring in that nuanced body of writings on this work with a very very I would say a kind of flexible origin within modern, like, it's bringing that to the, for me as a teacher, it's like, bringing this body of knowledge to the classroom means something, like engaging with a different set of aesthetic knowledge. Something that cannot be fully rationalized, but you cannot just, throw it off as like, something that deals with metaphysical. So it's kind of maybe a kind of cross pressure, like pulled into different dimensions, pulled toward transcendence, but also pulled towards a kind of exclusive humanism. But the works resist both. And in some sense, these works, like, that is one of the next point that I want to pitch. It is also the way in which his works dealing, or like, engaging with this work, his works kind of force us to de-link from Western ideas of modernity in some sense, which is also like kind of commonplace knowledge now. Like everyone is very critical of this idea of Western modernity, but the very insistence that you have to choose between tradition and modernity, or between religious or sacred knowledge and the secular pedagogy, that is what this kind of like, this project refuses to stick to that kind of a binary, and in some ways it urges us to de-link, borrowing Mignolo's term, de-link from this demands of that kind of very binary oriented imagination of modernity, and maybe it is also practicing something like what we can call border thinking, where you can maintain multiple epistemological worlds without their subordination to a single universal framework. And one last point, I also want to talk in terms of the idea of the materiality of the religious, and the idea of like, the untransability of the translatability of the form that we talk about here. So if you think in terms of when Venkatappa, for instance, especially like, the way in which Venkatappa tries to translate the religious forms into European sculptural conventions, what he produces might be like, Pushpamala argues that it is provocative, and precisely because they are, in some ways these works are also trying to like, this attempt itself is resisting this violence and the impossibility of this kind of a translation. And yeah, so in some ways the untranslatable dimensions of his practice, and the way in which uh, certain practices which are rooted in region, in religion, in lived realities of people, that they also kind of present a kind of untranslatable dimension, and which challenges what we call the universal notion of the modern. So yeah, so in some sense, like I would say, this is kind of a decolonial worlding process that happens here. There are, a couple of this kind of a practice, maybe we can situate this within the broader intellectual history. And particularly, like, Parthamita's essay in the volume which talks about the alternative regional avant-garde, which talks about the pan-Asian kind of an imagination that springs from his work. I also found it very interesting because I was thinking about reading a lot of early 20th century writers from reform leaders and writers from Kerala, who were all trying to make, and since my archive also was mostly constitutive of writing from Muslim reformists, they were all trying to connect to places like Egypt. There are like correspondences, like borrowings from philosophers, thinkers, practitioners in places which are like non-Western. So I just thought that it's quite interesting, particularly in the southern part of India, where like the idea of modernity was not directly linked to the national imagination, but also like the diverse locations they were looking at. Particularly when I think about somebody like Vakam Maulavi from Kerala, mostly like he used to have regular correspondence with this important Egyptian philosopher Rashid Rida. So these engagements are like also very important for us to think about situating discourses. Is it always needed to think about the modern in terms of the national imagination? I'll just take a minute and then stop. So the kind of like the way in which we imagine modernity, or the modern in terms of nationalism and the Bengal modern, and even like locating art in connection with these imaginations. There are different kinds of social historical contexts, which like a lot of us in the south may not relate with in that sense, when we talk about the national modern. So the extension, for instance, is it an alternate regional avant-garde, or like does that make word make sense? Like the alternate, is it needed like at all? This is not a response to Western idea of modernism, and it's not simply like a response, a challenge to Western modernism, or something that can be defined only in terms of the colonial modern or the Western modern. But these are like these are, I would like to think of these as cosmopolitan projects that derive from multiple sources. For instance, the example I mentioned about Kerala in terms of Egypt and other parts of the world, in Venkatappa's case, like Japanese aesthetics, or even European modernism is just one of the constitutive elements. It is but at the same time, it is also arguing for its own distinctive logic. I am he was not, in that sense, he was not losing between tradition and modernity, I would say, or between region and nation, or between sacred and secular. I feel like he was navigating multiple world, making projects which produced new forms of cosmopolitanism, new configurations, and new understandings of what could modern mean. And for me, this new understanding of what and it pulls us to different directions. So in that kind of a context, I think this art, the collection of this body of work, it has something to offer. It offers as a model to think and create within a pluriversal condition, without demanding the disappearance of the region or the spiritual or the sacred. But it is also not directing us towards a singular cultural origin, which also means like the other idea, when you say decolonial, it's not about moving to another homogenization of culture. Rather, it is about like in that sense, I was thinking about the nation in some sense, and I thought, like, is it always important to think about the nation in terms of the modern? And like as a colleague of mine told, in a very jovial context, he was saying, see, uh, anti-national is already taken, so we should talk about non-national futures. So probably this is one of that moment for me. Okay. Thank you.
With this, I think we'll open the house for more questions and debates regarding Venkatappa. I think we have about 10 minutes more. We've crossed the limits of time. Anybody from the audience?
There's a hand there.
We also have Dimple Shah as Venkatappa.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for your wonderful session. It was very fun listening to all of you. And Ashish sir, after your genealogy also, I think I'm still seeking for some clarification on the panel's stand on whether or not Venkatappa is anti-establishment. Because Pushpamala ma'am said he is anti-establishment. Janaki Nair ma'am said that the state is an integral part. And I'm not being pedantic, and I'm not saying you must pick one. If you're saying that he exists in this contextual plurality, I'll accept it. But I'm asking, I'll tell you why. It's because this version, this book, takes on a new methodology, as the editors say. Should I come in the front?
No, there's just this light over here.
Switch on the projector.
Yeah, the projector can be switched off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Switch off the projector.
Yes.
Projector. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good.
Can't see.
Yeah, I'm not being pedantic. I'm asking because since this book experiments with a new methodology and of reconceptualizing, you say that Venkatappa is being seen as a discursive space. That was very interesting. So I was wondering, since Ma'am Janaki ma'am pointed out that he was very aware of the fact that he's writing to an audience in the future, which we might as well be. Recently, Bangalore Literature Festival was moved to Freedom Park in Bangalore, and as Sherin ma'am would know, in Hyderabad Literature Festival, which happens in this corporate, concrete site, which is not very different from what used to happen in Bangalore. It used to happen in the Hotel Taj. So, what is Freedom Park is a protest site, and it has been moved. The Bangalore Literature Festival, which might as well feature the artwork and literally the work of Venkatappa, has been moved to Freedom Park. So, in the context of the postmodern neoliberal nation and its relationship vis-a-vis art and the consumers of art, like ma'am says, maybe perhaps we must think of non-national futures. I feel compelled to ask that is this a movement of democracy? Like, really, is it? Or is it like it's easy for the state to ignore protests in Freedom Park, and hence it is easy for them to ignore literature in Freedom Park? So, should we stop congratulating ourselves for merely the fact that art exists or that it has survived?
It's a very global question. I mean, vast.
Janaki should
Yeah, Janaki should answer.
Janaki should answer.
That's a really sprawling question. So I cannot speak for all parts of that question. I will simply answer the question you asked about whether he is anti-establishment. Actually, that was one point on which I actually disagreed with Pushpa, because I don't think he was anti-establishment. He was very much looking for support, A, from the palace and later on from the state, in ways that don't mark out somebody who is anti-establishment. He was, cantankerous in terms of the kinds of cases that he filed. So in that sense, he was anti many different things, and protective of the way his art was portrayed. So I don't think that he represents in some ways some kind of flamboyant, figure who's against. Because when you see his correspondence with Regiwala, for instance, he was fully immersed in negotiating and bargaining and so on and so forth. This continues into the 1950s when he's bargaining with Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay about which, how much he should be paid. So he's not anti-establishment, really speaking. He has some sort of idea of himself. As I said, the most appropriate thing to describe him is what this Bourdieu describes as anti-economic economy. He believed that he was not actually participating in the economy when in fact he was.
You call the economy the establishment. I mean, why is there a contradiction between him fighting for? Sorry. Why is there a contradiction between him fighting for to get his dues and not being anti-establishment?
I am saying that the kind of transition that he represents from a culture of patronage to an art market, which in some ways he negotiated. The patronage ended very dramatically and almost overnight in 1940, by which time he had already started the negotiations with what we might call an art market in terms of collector and
commission works.
Yeah, commission works, etc. So he, in that sense, is an interesting figure who's negotiating both these realms of power, I would say, to the extent that he is not rejecting them. He is not that way an anti-establishment figure. He is not saying I will not take my, I'll allow my works to be sold to collectors and so on. That comes only much later when he has, got a new idea.
How did he see himself vis-a-vis people like Siddhalinga Swami, who was clearly a matha artist, coming from a carpenter background, and he painted in the court and stuff like that. So and in my mind, I was also thinking about people like Mokshagurdam Vishveshwaraya and other men who are carving these new kinds of subjectivities in the Mysore court. If you have anything to say to that, I'd appreciate it. Because Siddhalinga Swami represents, in some sense, an older order, whereas people like Diwan Mirza Ismail and Mokshagurdam Vishveshwaraya and Venkatappa represent something, a new vector. Thank you.
Venkatappa doesn't mention any other artists actually in his diaries, and like he's a supreme egotist actually. So I don't think he recognized anyone else. So he's quite a character, and I mean, in fact, one of the strange things is that he doesn't have. I mean, after the Bengal school, I think he's very friendly with the writers and philosophers, anybody except artists. C.V. Raman, scientists, all kinds of. Homi Baba. He knew all these, especially I think after he moved to Bangalore, but in Mysore he was very friendly with the scientists and the philosophers, I mean with the writers and philosophers and musicians. So I don't think he wanted any competition, and I think he felt he was quite superior to anyone else working there. Maybe like he was, because he had been, exposed to the national at that point. I don't know if anyone else had gone out at that point and was part of the national movement. Like he definitely felt he was more, I think, superior and cosmopolitan. But Janaki, I have a problem when you say that now art is defined by the market. I don't agree at all. In fact, okay, there is the art market, but there is a market for everything else as well. I mean, it's not that only art has a market or something like that. Academics also has a market, and you can also, artists can argue that academics are like whatever, this thing, be bowing to the market, for example. But what I want to say, there's a lot of different kinds of art exist. In fact, many of them which are nothing to do with any gallery or any space, like performance art, for instance, or many other experimental things that people are doing, installations or any kind of, so many experiments are going on which are not actually lucrative at all, but people are doing it either singly or getting together and doing it. And I don't think you can define and say, yes, corporatization has happened post 90s, and there's certain kinds of art being made maybe, but other kinds of art are also being made. So it's not that this whole market system has taken over. And in fact, the whole WAG Forum agitation is to actually save Venkatappa, a public space, a common democratic space from the market, from the corporates actually. Corporatization is taking place, and yes, there is market is more, but it's not that there wasn't any market. Even when you write about Venkatappa, you're talking about his negotiating with the market for himself. In fact, every discipline or every area has a market. I mean, a salary is also a market.
My remark is in the context of what was seen as an overwhelming presence of the state in determining, art production, art futures in the form of, and in fact that was my paper in your Somberikatte. You may not remember, but it was about the academies, and the academies as they established a particular kind of stake for the state in artistic production on the one hand, in musical production, in literary production, the huge state academies which were established nationally by Maulana Azad in the immediate post-independence period around the 1950s is very much a moment when the state is dominating the imagination of the creative. Okay, so we are very far away from that moment, is what I'm trying to say. I'm not singling out artists as being the only ones who are making gestures towards the market, not at all. I'm saying that we are at a very different moment where the state's role in this kind of encouragement of the artists and bestowing prizes, even prizes are no longer so much desired to the extent that they are coming from the state as they are coming from private organizations and from art markets worldwide and museums worldwide and so on and so forth. So we have a completely transfigured space which definitely represents something very different from the immediate post-independence years. So I would say the first 3 decades or so, yeah, you could talk about an art world which is in some ways determined by the state, which is in some ways determined by critics who are in some ways serving the state to a certain extent, but no longer. I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, I just want to add, Venkatappa mentions only Keshavaya in his diary.
That's right, yeah.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Yeah. It may sound as a bit of a digression, but I read this book by Professor Shiv Kumar on Abhinavanath Tagore and how central the idea of nation was for the Bengal school, and so on and so forth. But recently, I had no idea of asking questions, but I recently read this book by Sir Penderell Moon, who was a former ICS officer, called The British Conquest of India. Now, it may appear as a digression, but I'm a little confused about it, that's why. And since the very first word is nation in the title of your book, so Penderell Moon talks about the period right after the mutiny. So he talks right after 1857, where he talks about how, the locals and the British interacted in a very, very amicable way, which is rather surprising because you had such a bloody mutiny. So he makes this comment, it's just a paragraph which really caught my attention, where he says that, are Indians really capable of some kind of a loyalty towards larger abstractions like nation? Now, it may be a British bias and so on, but I must remind people that Sir Pendleton Moon was someone who was very sympathetic to the national movement. He later stayed on post-independence, became Chief Secretary of Himachal and so on and so forth. So this is a larger question I've always had. What is the idea of nation in terms of, like, even people like Venkatappa, is it just an idea which is indexed to religion, Hindu nationalism? So you find a lot of that in Bengal School of Art and even the images that I've seen in Venkatappa. So since both of you, Ashish and Janaki ma'am, both of you all mentioned nation, and that became so central. I think Ashish mentioned the idea of nation post 47 and what is the idea, and the same with Janaki Nair. So I just want you all to sort of probably just comment on that. I mean, was there a whole idea of nation? And the reason I mentioned that is because Bengal School was again very elite-led, the Tagore family and so on and so forth. And in some senses, there's also the latter period of the 19th century. There is a theory that says that the British were reaching out to the marginalized groups. If you really look at their policies and so on and so forth. So in many senses, this was some kind of an outreach, some kind of a sort of effort by the elites in order to sort of preserve traditional power structures. So in the Indian national movement itself is sometimes interpreted that way, especially post 19th century, because there was an empowering of the marginalized happening because of British policies, and maybe that is when you see suddenly Tagore writing changing. I'm not accusing them of being casteist or whatever. They were people of the Enlightenment and all that, I acknowledge. But I'm a little confused here, and since you're sort of acknowledged experts here, so I just thought of sharing the confusion.
No, again, huge questions. But just in a sentence, I think I'll simply say this, that there have been a lot of very interesting work suggesting that there have been theories of nationality going a long way back in the place that we now know as India. For example, Tamil nationalism goes back into the late 19th century. Bengal nationalism has a long history of that. And Indian nationalism has a comparatively recent history. It's not something that very long precedes the birth of the Indian state in 1947. I mean, it was something that you might even say was kind of cobbled together as a relatively hasty measure to cater to that particular moment. I mean, one argument that's made is that after the end of the Second World War, a lot of the former colonies actually turn into states and have to produce a kind of rough and ready definition of the nation that will work at that time. And in that context, Indian nationalism is very much a work in progress. It is a contentious, deeply fraught situation in which different parts of India have very, very complicated, this relationship with what Indian nationalism is. So, what is interesting for me are three things. One is, I think Janaki's Mysore model, which in a way I think produces a framework for this book, talks about the very fraught relationships between Mysore and Kannada nationalism. That distinction is something that's really not something we've thought about enough, and the really complicated ways in which initial literature, but eventually popular nationalism and the cinema actually then more or less take over from that Mysore thing and refabricate it. Now, in that context, Venkatappa's ambivalence vis-a-vis Mysore on the one hand, Kannada on the other, to say nothing of India, is a very interesting conjuncture, and that's the only way I think one can think of it. It's symptomatic of a certain kind of crisis that's there. And in that context, I wanted to. I mean, the art market thing is a very interesting question, I feel, because for me, Ravi Verma is crucial here because Ravi Verma seems to be able to make a transition into an art market without, as it were, losing his elite status. It was not that he had to then think about, am I an artist or am I whatever, something. That problem doesn't exist for him, and the ability. So subsequently, the entire sort of history of commodification, which becomes quite a crucial location for the birth of the independent artist. The independent artist is independent. Why? Because he or she is able to eventually become independent of their patron by surviving in an autonomous space, and autonomy then constitutes the commodified space in which you can survive in the market, give or take. And I think Venkatappa's ambivalence on that front. I mean, the fact that he was highly, you might say, money-minded or whatever, highly litigious, at the same time as he was, as the editors say, otherworldly, is a very interesting conjuncture. Which are very. I mean, the way, in a sentence, it's like this: the way very large histories are played out at that very individual level, in terms of how an artist chooses his materials or how they survive, becomes a very interesting way of doing it. And I think this book is remarkable for that reason. Being able to pull that the set of connections off.
Can I just respond in one sentence to this question, which is very intriguing and interesting to me? I want to respond to you by saying you are emphasizing to me all the more reason why I should offer a course on Indian nationalism. If the only book you're reading at this moment is Pendrell Moon, I mean, there has been like an industry of writing on Indian nationalism and Indian nation, not least in the field of aesthetics and so on. And I think there is a certain kind of urgency now to revisit this question in ways that are different from what we are surrounded by at the moment.
I think we've come to the end of today's program.
I think I see Mr. Venkatappa sitting in the audience. Can we call him
Yes, please,
to the stage?
Venkatappa is seen through the many lenses of all these scholars, artists, and is also opened up new ways in which we can really engage with him and
ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ ನಾನು ಒಂದೇ ಮಾತು ಹೇಳಕ್ಕೆ ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತೀನಿ. ನನ್ನ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮತ್ತೆ ನನ್ನ ಲೈಫ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನೋಡ್ಬೇಕಂದ್ರೆ ನನ್ನ ಡೈರೀಸ್ನ ನೋಡಿ. ಯಾಕಂದ್ರೆ ನಾನು ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಆರ್ಟಿಸ್ಟ್ ಆದ್ಮೇಲೆ ಸರ್ವೈವ್ ಆಗಬೇಕು. ನಾನು ರಾಜ್ಯದ ಕೆಳಗಡೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೆ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಇಂಡಸ್ಟ್ರಿಗೆ ಬಂದೆ. ಬಟ್ ಒಂದು ಐಡೆಂಟಿಟಿ, ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಐಡೆಂಟಿಟಿ ಬರೋದು ನಮ್ಮ ರೀಜನ್ ಇಂದ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್. ಸೊ ಅದು ಎರಡನ್ನೂ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ತಗೊಂಡೋಗಿ ಮುಂದೆ ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಕಂದ್ರೆ ನಾನು ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತೆ.
To MG Road to see a lot of movies on Plaza Theatre, and there is a diary notation where he thinks he loved Walt Disney's animations. So here is another cosmopolitanism which you can look at, and I'm sure if he was alive today, I think he'd be. Yes, he's very much next to me, but I'm sure that he'll be making one of these Rajmouli films or whatever. Thank you very much for this evening, and thank all the speakers for their very enlightened talks. You're bringing Venkatappa alive, not only literally, but also, yes, in many ways that this opens up a lot of ways in which we can look at the regional, the modern nation, and many other things that we are much concerned about. Thank you, and have a good night.
ವೆಂಕಟವ್ರದ್ದು ಒಂದು ತುಂಬಾ ಧನ್ಯವಾದ. ಗೋ ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ ಇನ್ ಟೈಮ್ಸ್.
ಸರ್ ಆರ್ಟಿಸ್ಟ್ ನೇಮ್ ಹೇಳಿ.
JMS ಮಣಿ.
Teacher and consultant.
ಇದು ನನ್ನ ಗುರು ಅವ್ರದ್ದು ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು. Yeah, it's my guru, and I'm really privileged to get this. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So before we conclude, I request a moment, please. I request our director, Ms. Priyanka Mary Francis, to kindly come up on stage and give a small token of appreciation for all the panelists. Meantime, thank you one and all for joining us here for this panel discussion. And I'm sure the understanding of life and legacy of Mr. Venkatappa has been deepened with this panel discussion. And meantime, announcement: tomorrow, please join us at 3 o'clock for the screening of 5 films: Grasslands, Greener on the Other Side. At 3 p.m., Docu Dialogue, Watch, Talk, Share, which is brought to you by National Gallery of Modern Art Bengaluru in collaboration with the Naturalistic School. And in the morning for kids, we have theatre and art workshop at 11:30, aged between 9 and 14. So please join us at 11:30. Please bring your kids for this. It's an hour workshop.
Sorry, in all the excitement, this wasn't done, but I'd like to thank the NGMA for organizing this event. It's really wonderful, so well organized. And I'd also like to thank IFA, India Foundation for the Arts, who gave me the funding for the seminar in 2016.